Before you start thinking about what the Federal Reserve System should look like for the next 100 years, you need to understand why it was created, how it works, and what its critics say about it. The Fed is the guardian of our money supply, so let's start by considering money. Why do we need money at all? Economists say money has three functions: a medium of exchange, a unit of account, and a store of value. The medium of exchange function means that we need money to help us make trades. If we didn't have money, we would have to use some other method for making trades. One system would be barter, exchanging one good for another like fish for beans. This is problematic because you have to locate a double coincidence of wants: someone who has what you want and wants what you have. You also have to reach agreement on the proper ratio and be able to make change. Early humans created commodity money such as stones, shells, beads, silver, and gold to reduce the transaction cost of the barter system. These commodity monies also helped address the other two functions of money. Gold coins could serve as a unit of account, or a way to price goods: 2 coins for 1 cow. Gold coins also stored value, so an individual who had gold coins would be confident of their value tomorrow and in the future. So why not use gold now? Some critics would like to see a return to what is called a gold standard, in which money is redeemable for a fixed amount of gold. While that might seem like a good idea because it gives people trust in their currency, it can cause problems. If you rely on gold for money, then you can only have as much money as there is gold. If gold becomes more expensive or more precious, people become unwilling to trade it for other goods. A growing economy needs a growing money supply, and a gold standard makes that nearly impossible. The gold standard could actually stifle the economy and make it impossible to obtain the financial capital needed to start a new business. In order for a money system to work, it has to be stable and secure, of course. People have to trust that it is worth something. But it also has to be flexible and able to adjust to changes in the economy, and commodity monies are not flexible. Back to the stability point, what does give our money value? Paper money doesn't have any inherent value, and as we just discussed, our money doesn't represent any other commodity like gold. Our money has fiat value. It has value because the government has declared that it is legal tender for all debts, public and private. Despite fears about inflation and, because before the most recent crisis, a fear that the euro would become more prominent, our dollar is still respected as one of the world's safest currencies. But not all paper money has been successful. The success of our paper money is partly tied to the Fed itself. Let's look back in U.S. history at what happened, money-wise, before the Fed. By the 1800s, most Americans were buying and selling goods and services with paper money, not fur pelts or gold coins. But this paper money was issued by all sorts of different places. Some was national, but some was state or local money, or even tied to a specific bank. When people wanted to travel far or buy goods from other places, their money was no good. Whenever a bank failed, their banknotes became useless. This made people very distrustful of paper money. To make what matters worse, banks failed often. The U.S. went through a bank panic about every 20 years. 1819, 1837, 1857, 1873, 1893, 1907. Every time savers lost tons of money, businesses went bankrupt, and the economy was thrown into a recession. Why did all these bank panics and bank failures happen? It's partly inherent to the way banks work. The U.S., like most countries, uses a system called fractional reserve banking. You deposit your money in the bank and it becomes bank reserves. The bank keeps a portion of these reserves and lends out or invests the rest. That's how banks make money, by taking the money you deposit and lending it to someone who wants to buy a house or a car or go to college. They pay the money back with interest, and the bank earns profits. This system is actually key to our money supply. If you look at this chart, you can see that borrowed money creates new deposits, which create more borrowing and more deposits, and so on and so on. Fractional reserve banking allows for a very flexible money supply. We'll talk a lot more about the system in Unit 4, but you can probably already see the problem. What if the banks have lent out most of the money and then suddenly all of the depositors show up to get their money out and there isn't enough money there? That's what happened over and over before we had the Fed. Farmers borrowed money to plant their crops, and when the crops failed and they had no profits, they couldn't pay back the loans. The depositors' money was just gone. In other cases, it was real estate prices or railroads. Every time a business venture didn't pan out, depositors were left holding the bag. 1907 was one of the worst. There was a recession in many businesses, and then banks fell into bankruptcy. Smaller banks turned to larger banks, like New York City banks, for loans, but those banks refused to take a chance with their own deposits. During this crisis, the New York Stock Exchange fell almost 50%. It might have been a lot worse, but J.P. Morgan, one of the wealthiest men in America, pledged his own personal money to shore up the banking system. Just 1 year later, a Senate commission began to investigate the crisis and propose solutions, which led to the creation of the Fed. But why were we counting on J.P. Morgan? Why didn't we already have a central bank? Other countries like England and France and China had a long history of having central banks. The answer lies in Americans' distrust of central banking authorities. You might remember from U.S. history that Alexander Hamilton, one of the founding fathers, was a big promoter of having a central bank. He believed it was essential to the development of a strong market economy. Other prominent founders, like Jefferson and Madison, argued that such a bank was not only unconstitutional, since the Constitution did not authorize it, but that it would benefit merchants and investors at the expense of the rest of the American people. The bank, the first bank in the United States, was created, but it disappeared when its initial charter expired in 1811. Ultimately, Madison agreed to charter a second bank in the United States in 1816, but it was just as controversial. It became a point of controversy in the 1832 election. Andrew Jackson vetoed the recharter bill, slayed the bank, and won re-election on his anti-bank platform. So we were left without a bank from 1836, when the charter expired, until 1913. In 1913, following the century of bank panics, Congress decided to authorize a new type of central bank, the Federal Reserve System, now commonly nicknamed the Fed. This was a completely new type of system, a blend of public leadership and private ownership. The Fed is a national bank, but it is not exactly a central bank. The top leadership is the Board of Governors, 7 people appointed to 14-year terms. The governors are appointed by the President and confirmed by the Senate. Their terms are staggered, meaning every 2 years someone's term is up. That way, they're not all new at the same time, and they're not all tied to one president. These 7 individuals include the most prominent leader of the economy, the Federal Reserve Chairman. In February of this year, Janet Yellen was sworn in as Fed Chair. She's the first woman in that role. But the governors do not make all policy decisions on their own. They work on a committee called the Open Market Committee, a group of 12 people that also includes 5 Reserve Bank presidents. If you look at this map, you can see that here's the map. If you look at this map, you can see that the Fed system includes 12 reserve banks. You'll notice most of them are on the eastern seaboard, because that's where most of the population was in 1913. These banks function as bankers' banks in their respective regions. You'll see there's a Federal Reserve Bank in Minneapolis. This Fed is owned by member banks in the 9th District, banks like U.S. Bank and TCF and Wells Fargo. Those banks are involved in selecting the president of the Minneapolis Fed, who is currently Narayana Kocherlakota. Kocherlakota works with the Board of Governors to set policy, but he does not work for them. That's the interesting part of the public-private blend. Also, Kocherlakota reports to his own board of directors, which includes prominent business leaders from the region. So what exactly does the Fed do? It has a lot of roles. Some of them are very routine. Here's a list. The Fed takes deposits from its member banks, so a bank like U.S. Bank has its own account there. The Fed is extremely secure, so banks feel safe storing large sums of cash there rather than in their own vaults. The Fed also plays a role in bank supervision, so the Fed sends teams of bank examiners in to check banks' accounting books. They're supposed to ensure that banks don't make too many risky loans and cause another panic. Some people questioned the Fed's competence in this area during the recent financial crisis, but most of the mortgage dealers and investment banks were actually not under Fed authority prior to 2007. The Fed has more authority now, thanks to the Dodd-Frank Act. If a bank is short on required reserves, the portion of its deposits it is required to keep, the Fed acts as a lender of last resort, kind of like J.P. Morgan used to be. The Fed is also the government's bank, which means it takes deposits of tax revenues, and government checks come from its account at the Fed. One minor role, which used to be bigger, is check clearing. The Fed used to have a massive network of employees who were responsible for processing checks, from paychecks to birthday money, and moving money around between banks' accounts. Today, people use a lot fewer checks. They use a lot more debit cards and electronic transactions, so most of the Fed's check processing facilities have been shut down. The Fed does not print or mint money, but it does issue currency. Most people do not bring cash when they go to their local bank. They bring checks or transfer money electronically, but they want cash to be there when they need it. The Fed delivers millions of dollars to banks every day. When banks send in cash to be deposited in their Fed reserve accounts, the Fed checks the bills for counterfeits and also for bills that need to be taken out of circulation. Most bills actually don't last very long. One role many Americans do not know much about is that the Fed stores both money and gold for foreign governments and some international organizations, like the International Monetary Fund. The New York Fed has the world's largest gold deposits, even larger than Fort Knox. But this gold belongs to foreign nations, not to the U.S. Finally, we are at the most important function of the Fed, managing the nation's money supply. While most of the functions I talked about before are conducted by the individual district banks, monetary policy is done at the national level. The Fed has a dual mandate for managing the money supply. It is supposed to promote maximum employment and stable prices. Since 1979, it has focused on price stability, in other words, fighting inflation. The committee I mentioned earlier, the Federal Open Market Committee, is responsible for managing the money supply. The FOMC, which includes the 7 governors and 5 of the bank presidents, has several tools it can use to make the money supply larger or smaller. These tools are the reserve requirement, the discount rate, and open market operations. The reserve requirement is the portion of bank deposits that a bank must keep on hand. We talked about this earlier. The current requirement is 10%, which means a bank can lend out 90% of your checking account deposit and actually all of your savings account. The Fed could change this to 8%, which would increase the money supply, or 15%, which would decrease the money supply by forcing banks to lend less. The discount rate, the second tool, is the rate the Fed charges member banks for those loans of last resort. When the discount rate is very low, like right now, at 0.75%, that actually encourages banks to borrow from the Fed and make more loans. But in 1980, when Fed Chairman Paul Volcker was very concerned about double-digit inflation, the discount rate was at 20%. That discouraged banks from borrowing and lending, and it dramatically reduced the money supply. This did cut inflation, but it caused unemployment. Sometimes member banks don't want to borrow from the Fed because it looks bad. Their borrowing activity is made public. During the recent financial crisis, the Fed created another tool called term auction facilities, which allowed banks to anonymously borrow money for short periods of time. This helped encourage more lending activity again, or put more liquidity in the system. The last major tool is called open market operations. The Fed buys and sells U.S. government bonds called Treasury bills to increase or decrease the money supply. If the Fed wants our money supply to grow, it will buy bonds from banks and individual citizens. The Fed gets the bonds, and the people get the money, so there's more money in circulation. The opposite, selling bonds, will reduce the money supply. Of course, in order to do its work, the Fed must also count the money supply. The Fed uses 2 measures to count our money supply. M1, the measure of liquid money, which includes cash, coins, checking accounts, and traveler's checks, and M2, which also includes savings accounts. You can see from this graph, there we can see it pretty well. You can see from this graph published by the St. Louis Fed that the Fed has dramatically increased the money supply in the past few years. This is just the area since the last recession started. Now that you know most of the structure and functions of the Fed, you should do some additional reading on the Fed Essay Contest website and other sites and consider some of the issues that make the Fed controversial. There are some issues of the Fed's basic ability to do its job. Can the Fed really control this thing called the money supply? What if people spend their money more frequently? That's the issue of velocity. They could potentially cause inflation. Will the Fed's actions of the past few years, like that last graph, set us up for another terrible round of double-digit inflation? Another issue, can the Fed really do anything to combat unemployment? Interest rates have been at historic lows for 5 years. Has it helped? This issue is called cyclical asymmetry. The Fed is better at fighting inflation than unemployment. As I mentioned earlier, another question is, did the Fed do enough to prevent the recent financial crisis? Since it is run by people appointed by the president and by bankers, is it really that separate from the system and able to monitor it? Major Fed critics like Ron Paul have called for abolishing the Fed. Some want to return to a gold standard. Some, especially libertarians, want to return to private money like we had in the 19th century. Some see the future in currencies like Bitcoin. As you think about your answer, think about all of these questions. Is the Fed competent? Is it too political? Is it archaic, like the pennies it still distributes? More importantly, what alternatives are available? Do we need a stronger central bank? Should we be joining a one-world currency, more like the euro? I encourage you to read as much as you can about these issues before deciding on your position for the essay. And feel free to ask either me or Mr. Calls if you have more questions.